G7. In 2023, Japan hosted the G7 Summit. The meeting took place in May in Hiroshima, a city that suffered from atomic bombing. G7 leaders visited the Atomic Bomb Museum, met with survivors of the explosion, and heard the stories. Many heads of state wrote in the museum's guest book that the use of nuclear weapons should never happen again. What is G7? How and why did it emerge? What issues are addressed during its meeting? What global problems have the leaders of the group been able to solve? Why are there only 7 of them? We will seek answers of those and other questions in today's program. G7 is a group of industrially developed countries. Its members include the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. G7 members are major economies collectively controlling over half of the global net wealth, 30–40% of the global GDP, and 10% of the world's population. Thus, countries are key players in international trade and investment. G7 members are major power in global affairs and mutually support close cooperation in political, economic, and military spheres. G7 plays a crucial role in shaping the global agenda and influencing the world economy. However, the Group of 7 is not an international organization. It's not based on an international treaty, doesn't have a permanent secretariat, and lacks a formal character. Moreover, decisions made within the G7 are not legally binding. G7 doesn't possess its formal decision-making mechanism typically found in government structure. Instead, the group serves as a forum for exchanging views and coordinating policies among its members. Discussions and decisions taken at G7 summits often have significant and even decisive consequences for the global economy and politics. The G7 had its origins in informal meetings of top financial officials from leading Western countries. In March 1973, the US Secretary of the Treasury, George Shultz, organized a meeting with his counterparts from Western Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. It was a time of economic crisis in the world, and the major global economists wanted to have a common plan to confront the new challenges. The first meeting took place in the White House Library, and initially this group of 4 countries was called the Library Group. Later that year, Shultz proposed adding Japan, thus forming the Group of 5. For 2 years, the meeting involved consultations among financial ministers and leading economists. In November 1975, at the initiative of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who had become the president of France by the time, the first summit of heads of state and the government from 6 countries was held at the Château Rambouillet near Paris. Italy was invited to join the Group of 5 at this summit. The French president was joined by Helmut Schmidt, Aldo Moro, Tokyo Fukuda, Harold Wilson, and Gerald Ford. At the first summit, major economic issues were discussed, including the oil crisis, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and the ongoing global economic downturn. As a result of the meeting, the Rambouillet Declaration was adopted, which, among other things, expressed a commitment to free trade, rejecting of the discrimination and aggression in trade, cooperation with developing countries, and rapprochement with the Eastern Bloc. It was also decided to hold similar meetings annually. For the next summit in Puerto Rico, the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, was invited. This became the first G7 summit in its current format. A year later, in 1977, the United Kingdom, as the host of the G7, proposed inviting representatives of the European Union to all summits. This included the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council. G7 leaders' meetings take place once a year, usually in the summer, in the country of the current chair. In addition to formal sessions, there are also numerous informal meetings and consultations where leaders can discuss topics more openly and find common interests. The summit attracts attention from the global community and are accompanied by significant security measures due to the potential for protests and demonstrations. In the 1980s, the G7 expanded the scope of its interests. It began to discuss not only economic issues but also international security problems and conflicts. For example, the group sought to resolve ongoing conflicts between Iran and Iraq, as well as the issue of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. The invitation for Russia to join the group came after several years of intensive contacts and dialogues. The interest in the Soviet Union from the G7 increased in the late 1980s, when complex political and economic processes began in the USSR, leading to its dissolution. The Soviet leader was invited to the summit as a guest for the first time in the summer of 1991. In the following years, Russia was invited to the meeting as an observer. After the 1997 summit, Russia was officially invited and became a member of the group at the 1998 summit. Thus, the G7 transformed into the G8. For Russia, this was a significant advancement. At that time, it didn't possess the national wealth and financial weight of the other members. It was not a major developed economy and didn't have a liberal democracy. This invitation was extended during the transition to a post-communist economy to encourage political and economic reforms. In 2014, Russia violated international law and its commitments by annexing Crimea and unleashing armed aggression in Donbass. Immediately after the occupation of Crimea in March 2014, Russia's membership in the Group of 8 was suspended. By the way, that year, Russia was supposed to host the G8 leaders in Sochi. Initially, the country was not permanently excluded, with a display of openness and readiness for dialogue. However, feeling offended and not receiving a subsequent invitation, Russia announced in 2017 its final withdrawal from the G8. Subsequent leader meetings have been held in the format of the G7. In June 2020, Donald Trump suggested readmitting Russia to the group. But other participants didn't support this idea, and after February 2022, its return to the club of developed and civilized countries seems highly unlikely. Countries of the G7 have repeatedly and at all levels declared their support for Ukraine. They have supported its sovereignty, integrity, European choice and aspiration to join the European family. As mentioned earlier, immediately after the illegal annexation of Crimea, the group excluded Russia from its membership. The G8 format, which included Russia, lasted for 16 years. On the day the full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine began, February 24, 2022, the leaders of the G7 issued a joint statement. They condemned the aggression and stated that it fundamentally changed the architecture of European and global security. Urgent consultations among the foreign ministers were conducted, and the Group of 7 developed a package of sanctions against Russia. Furthermore, immediately after the start of the war, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz pledge the G7 countries would provide Ukraine with $50 billion. Within 2 months of that announcement, in May 2022, $20 billion were mobilized for Ukraine. You are right, there is no formal procedure for admission or exclusion from G7 membership. Any member can propose an invitation, and if there is a consensus among the other countries, it is accepted. There have been various proposals for expanding the group of 7. Different countries, both developed and developing economies, participate in the meetings as observers or guests. This tradition has been established since the early 1990s. Australia, India, Indonesia, Spain, South Korea, Vietnam, the Netherlands, Spain and other countries have regularly become members of the G7 Summit. International organizations are also invited to the summits. Representatives from International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization, International Labour Organization, World Bank and others participate in the discussion. This greatly enhances the effectiveness of the G7. But it should not be thought that G7 is only about annual summits for country leaders. In addition to high-level meetings, G7 also encompasses a range of other events and initiatives. Here are some of them. Ministerial meetings. Regular meetings are held in the ministerial levels and various areas such as finance, economy, foreign affairs, trade, energy, healthcare and others. Those meetings discuss issues and coordinate positions, which are later incorporated into G7's final documents. Ministers meet more frequently than leaders, up to 4 times in a year. Working groups and expert committees. G7 established those groups to prepare decisions and exchange information on specific topics. Those groups conducted research, discussed problems, and provide recommendations on priority areas such as economic policy, climate changes, anti-corruption efforts, and other areas. Consultations with the private sector and civil society. G7 engages with representatives from the business community, academic experts, and non-governmental organizations to consider the perspectives and experiences in the decision-making process. G7 members organize forums and conferences, inviting experts and representatives from other countries and organizations. Those platforms facilitate discussions on global issues and the search for joint solutions. Additionally, the G7 actively supports global development efforts and provides financial assistance in the fight against poverty. G7 members fund various projects and programs aimed at reducing inequality, improving education, healthcare, and infrastructure in developing countries. Participation in G7 meeting at any level is considered an honor and prestigious for any politician, whether it be a country leader, minister, or expert. Summits give leaders the opportunity to show their citizens that they are valued participants in the international community. They can demonstrate that they shape global policies rather than simply adhering to them, and that they are capable of defending national interests on the international stage. Participation in G7 confirms the status of a country leader on the international stage. G7 leaders are seen as key players in global politics and economics, and their opinions and decisions carry significant weight. Summits attract tremendous media attention from around the world. Involvement in those events provides an opportunity to demonstrate leadership and influence at a global level. Furthermore, Participation in G7 meetings allows for the strengthening of diplomatic relations between countries. Leaders have the opportunity to hold bilateral meetings, discuss important issues, and resolve contentious problems. The G7 has repeatedly expressed its support for Ukraine. In June 2022, the leaders of the member countries issued a joint statement. They pledged to provide humanitarian, economic, and defense support to Ukraine. They also committed to increase pressure on Russia and uniting for the victory of freedom in Europe. The G7 leaders have stated multiple times that they will support Ukraine for as long as necessary until the final victory. Furthermore, an important aspect is that the Group of Seven specifically addressed China. The countries called on China to support Ukraine and not assist Russia in its aggressive war. They urged China not to help Russia in evading the imposed sanctions. Sanctions are regularly discussed in meetings involving ambassadors, ministers, and leaders of the G7 countries. Decisions regarding gas price limits and embargoes on oil from aggressor countries are examples of outcomes resulting from agreements made within the G7. All sanction packages are formulated and receive support from this international forum. During G7 meetings, decisions are also made regarding the increase in supply of modern weapons to Ukraine and assistance in rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure. In the matter of Ukrainian recovery, the G7 actively collaborates with the other international organizations, such as the International Monetary Fund. Why are countries with significant economies like India and China not included in the group of G7? After all, they are two largest economies in the world in terms of GDP and actively participating in the international affairs. Their inclusion in the G7 would reflect the reality of the influence and economic power. China has repeatedly expressed its interest in participating in the dialogue and being present at the summit. So why does the group remain limited to only 7 countries? There are economic and political reasons behind this. At the time of the G7's formation, the countries included in it were the largest and most developed economies in the world. They had significant influence in international trade, finance, and innovation, making them key players in global issues. Additionally, the G7 participants shared similar values and principles such as pluralism, democracy, and representative governance. Today, arguments both in favor of and against expanding the G7 are being made. Among the arguments in favor is the realistic consideration of the global economic situation. Broader representation, including India and China, would help fully address the interests of different regions. Many global problems, such as climate change, security threats, and pandemic responses, require cooperation and coordination beyond the existing G7 members. The United States and Canada support the idea of including China in the G7. However, other countries express opposing arguments. Increasing the number of participants could complicate decision-making process and lead to more difficult negotiations and challenges. This is especially true considering Chinese tendency to adopt a special position on fundamental international issues. Concerns are also raised regarding Chinese policies in the context of human rights and trade. Apart from India and China, proposals have been made at different times to invite countries with the largest economies in various regions, such as Australia, Brazil, and South Africa, to the group. The expansion of the G7 remains a subject of discussion and may be considered in the future. What issues are raised at G7 summits and what global problems has it been able to solve over its existence? First and foremost, the G7 addresses global economic issues. In the mid-1990s, the Group of Seven launched a program to alleviate the debt burden of 42 poor countries. Debt restructuring had a positive impact on numerous developing nations, enabling them to improve education and healthcare, develop infrastructure and economic sectors, and ultimately enhance living standards and reduce poverty. Additionally, the G7 allocated 300 million for the construction of a shelter over the damaged reactor at Chernobyl. During the 2008 economic crisis, the G7 implemented various measures to support the global economy. The G7 has also been actively involved in various food security programs and providing assistance to hungry countries. For example, the G7 Global Food Security Initiative has provided financial and technical aid and resources to improve and develop agriculture in impoverished nations. The G7 participates in combating hunger by funding the Emergency Fund of the World Food Programme, which provides assistance in critical situations such as natural disasters, economic crises, and conflicts. In addition to global economic matters, the G7 addresses issues of international security, conflicts, and peacekeeping. For instance, in 1999, G7 leaders at Cologne Summit made the decision to authorize a ground invasion of Kosovo. Despite the absence of the United Nations Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force, during the conflict in Libya in 2011, the G7 supported NATO's military operation. In 2012, the group imposed economic sanctions on Iran due to its nuclear program. Following the onset of Russian aggression in Ukraine, the G7 implemented economic sanctions against Russia. At the G7 summit held in Japan in May 2023, the leaders of Ukraine participated as a special invited guests for the first time. Due to the ongoing full-scale war in Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky's visit was given a special status. The host of the summit, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who was born in Hiroshima, personally showed the Ukrainian leader the atomic bomb museum. Vladimir Zelensky participated in the general session of G7 leaders. The most important aspect was the conduct of bilateral meetings with the heads of influential countries in the world. In a day and a half, the Ukrainian president's team achieved the impossible, having a dozen bilateral meetings with the world leaders. In Hiroshima, not only the heads of the most developed countries gathered. The forum invited leaders of the European Union, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and South Korea. Representatives of the European Union, UN, International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization, and World Trade Organization were also present. All of the topics discussed at the summit involved mentioning Ukraine and condemning Russia's aggression, the expansion of anti-Russian sanctions, strengthening the coalition in support of Ukraine, issues of arms supplies, and the formation of financial basis for the recovery of Ukraine's economy were discussed. The president of Ukraine's trip to the summit also provided an opportunity to discuss the issue of Russian aggression with the head of countries that didn't participate in condemning Russia. These countries were India and Brazil. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the leaders of Ukraine and India held negotiations. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi expressed support for the Ukrainian people. The personal participation of the President of Ukraine in the G7 summit became a sensation and the #1 global topic. This fact was expected to cause discomfort in the Kremlin. However, the most significant outcome of this summit was the demonstration of a unified position regarding Russian aggression to the world. Another important step towards victory was taken in Hiroshima. There is a wide range of issues addressed at G7 meetings. Those include environmental problems, international trade and investments, migration and refugees, cybersecurity, human rights issues, and the fight against pandemic and global health threats. This is far from an exhaustive list of the problems discussed and tackled by the participants of the summits. At the 1999 summit, the Group of Seven helped create a new, broader platform and invited major emerging economies to participate in a global discussion. This led to the establishment of the Group of 20, G20. Initially, some members of the G20 promoted it as a replacement of the G7. However, both forums continue to exist in parallel. The G7 remains a format where developed countries discuss a wide range of economic, political, and security issues. On the other hand, the G20 has become a more inclusive platform primarily focused on global economics and finance. Russia has repeatedly made loud statements that it's not interested in participating of the G7 forum. However, its interest strangely appeared immediately after being excluded from it. Knowing the Russian dictator's love of attention, participation in high-level meetings, and the spotlight, one can assume that being expelled from the G7 was a significant blow to his ego. After all, it's a pleasure to feel like one of those who determine the fate to the world. After the start of the war, there were even suggestions in Moscow about creating an alternative to the G7. The head of the Russian State Duma announced the creation of a new geopolitical union. It was supposed to include Russia, China, Indonesia, India, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, and Iran. However, as customary in Russia, nothing substantial came out of the beautiful rhetoric and pompous words. Additionally, Russia cooperates with all the mentioned countries, except Iran, within the framework of the G20 or the BRICS format. What was behind Volodin's strange proposal remains unknown. Over the decade of its existence, the G7 has played and continues to play a significant role in addressing global economic, political, and security issues. It remains a forum where leaders can discuss complex issues and seek the joint solutions that have important implications for the world as a whole. G7 actively collaborates with other important platforms, such as G20, BRICS, the United Nations, and international and regional organizations. Their collective efforts contribute to more effective and comprehensive solutions to global problems. All of these examples of collective actions aimed at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals were developed by the United Nations General Assembly as a plan for a better and more sustainable future. Today, the G7 plays an important role in implementing this agenda.